I'm Beth Paraso, Senior News Writer at Tech Target, and this is IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech's Tragedy of the Commons. Emily Fox has held multiple roles at household name organizations in her 13-year IT career and is currently Senior Principal Software Engineer at Red Hat. Previously, she worked as an engineer at Apple and DevOps Security Lead at the National Security Agency. She also serves as chair of the CNCF's Technical Oversight Committee and is involved in a variety of open source communities and activities. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks so much, Beth, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Likewise. Thank you so much for taking the time. You're obviously very busy. So, security, and specifically the security of widely used open source libraries, is one of the facets of the discussions going on in the industry around open source sustainability. So, given your background in security, I wonder how you see that issue developing and whether things have changed on that front since Log4Shell.
Yes, things have started to change. I can definitely say that. There's been more advancements with organizations like the Open Source Security Foundation, who's issuing guidance to open source projects on how to manage their security appropriately. However, we do still have a huge gap within the open source ecosystem because some of the most critical projects don't exist on GitHub. They're not aware of these kinds of foundations work. And in some cases, their perspective of the library itself is that because it doesn't provide a security function or feature set, that they don't have a need or an obligation to provide security features, updates, and vulnerability management practices associated with the library. So we have a cultural challenge and kind of a divide within the ecosystem of more traditional open source projects and libraries from the more modern ones that live almost entirely on GitHub. And to date, I have not found a good practice by existing foundations or bodies to bridge that gap, to provide that security expertise, and to kind of be the partner in bringing some of those more heritage projects within the ecosystem to modern security standards and expectations. But ultimately, we still have a cybersecurity skill set gap, and the biggest part of that gap is open source security and open source vulnerability management. There is a ton of guidance, information, and materials out there that's available for projects to look at, to adopt, to exercise, and try out, but it's not something that's actively being integrated. We're not getting security engineers that show up to projects and say, hey, I'm here to help. I actually just got off of a call with the Post-Quantum Cryptography Alliance, who just started, and one of the questions that they had on the Technical Advisory Council is, we're engineers, we don't necessarily know how to do vulnerability management practices with open source projects. Can we get a working group together with experts in the area to be able to assist in development of this? Because as you know, post-quantum cryptography is super important, and we should have a vulnerability management plan for those projects. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen. We're getting started, but ultimately we need to connect the dots between these two disparate open source ecosystems.
Yeah, you mentioned a cultural issue and the ways that that's been described. Some people use tragedy of the commons. Some people quibble with that because software specifically is not a physically depletable resource. But I think the idea is that there's a ton of work and maintenance to be done and not enough people to do it. But plenty of people happy to take the product of what work is being done. So I know that the government, for example, has started getting involved with the open source security summits. Obviously, as you mentioned, OpenSSF has efforts around what they deem critical projects. We're clearly not going to solve these problems today, but how do you see a path, or do you see a path forward for those legacy projects? That's a facet I hadn't considered.
I think part of this is a generational education and awareness challenge. A lot of the security experts that exist within industry and a lot of these individuals that have been associated with projects for an extended period of time, they're so busy doing things that they're not realizing that they need to be identifying individuals to build the bench behind them to take that on. And those individuals, they're probably in high school right now, maybe they're in college and they're working on their new software engineering degree, but they're using modern languages because that's what software engineers want to do. They want to work on the latest and greatest things. They want to be able to ship code. But we do still have this existing history of legacy software languages that still need to be taught, and we need to encourage and incentivize younger software engineers coming into the industry to both learn secure development practices and understand how open source technologies work so they can contribute those skills to those heritage projects. But that still requires senior engineers like myself and others within industry to reach out actively to those individuals, identify them, coach them, and mentor them into providing support for those projects. And while there might be some curmudgeons out there with some of those projects, ultimately being open to understanding, being open to learning, asking questions in an open and collaborative manner so that you can take on the next generation of maintenance for that project that's critical, I think is the most important thing. And it's something as engineers within industry that we do not do a good enough job of. It's a skill set that we need to start refining more and more of, like, who's going to replace you on your project? Who's going to come in behind you as a maintainer? And why can they not start assisting you in the maintenance of the project to ease your own burden and give you some more of that time back to identify the next person behind them?
I mean, there are some people who also say, look, open source, the most important part of the license is that it's made available as is with no guarantees. And that if you're going to use that library or that software for a critical project, it's your responsibility to secure it. What's your view on that? How do you get end users more aware too and contributing maybe vulnerability remediation?
Completely agree about the licensing statement. That is within the purview of the maintainers of the project to define when they select that license or if they choose to change their license later. Part of that is being explicit and clear on what the guarantees of the software are that you're going to be providing and scoping your project accordingly. A lot of open source software projects I've encountered do not scope themselves correctly, so they end up getting feature creep or asked to do significantly more work beyond that, and then end up maintaining things that are beyond the what's currently available or what they had originally intended associated with their license of as is. I think there's still a human responsibility to kind of do the right thing, and that might vary culture to culture, individual to individual, based off of their own experiences, which is why it's so important that you reach out and you ask a little bit more of those learning questions to issue submitters or PR submitters about why you're doing this. I don't want to merge this PR because it goes against the as is, but taking the opportunity to leverage those individuals that do show up, that are asking questions, that are submitting PRs, that are contributing to your project. They're there to help. They're there to improve things, or at least to address their own needs, and understanding what their needs are can either help improve the adoption of the project or at least increase the attention and the individuals that are contributing to it so that you as a maintainer don't have to take on significant amounts of that burden. Could be that one of those maintainers just happens to be super interested in security vulnerability management, and that is not something you as a maintainer are interested in at all. Work with them, identify them as maybe the security team lead, and sync with them regularly within your project so that you understand what's going on. It may not necessarily need to be something that you are involved in day to day, but at least knowing that you have someone you can rely on to do that. The other part of your question on increasing enterprise contributions from organizations that are adopting these projects, there is a fundamental misunderstanding on the value that these projects have. If you as a business or an organization are adopting a piece of technology that is critical to your business to function, and when I say that, most C-suite executives think about, well, what's critical to my business to function is the financial operations of the organization.
Right.
But realistically, think about the infrastructure that all that relies on, whether or not you're using a cloud service provider or if you're doing your own thing on-prem. Think about how all of those open source components are critical to your ability to deliver secure software or to deliver and package up products and services to your customer. Maybe you're streaming video content or music. You need to understand that when those projects fail because of lack of contribution, your business can suffer. And it will end up costing a lot more. Because while open source may be free, it's free like a puppy. And that means not only do you have to do the work for integration into your environment, you are also expected to contribute back to the project your lessons and learnings from that integration to assist others. Most maintainers come from a background where they start a new idea, they get it going, they get tired of that, and then they run and they chase the next thing. That's totally fine. But ultimately, they lack the experience of that enterprise hyperscale. When day two operations start knocking on the door and you need to debug something that's running in production, or that vulnerability comes in, that expertise doesn't exist within most open source projects. So if you have that as an enterprise organization, contribute that knowledge back and those skills, because ultimately it's going to help your business's bottom line and your ability to deliver the software and services to your customers that you need.
Well stated. And I remember you also talking at KubeCon North America last year about efforts to get end users more involved with CNCF, even just to give feedback. And has that started to materialize?
It has. So the CNCF now has an end user technical advisory board that extends the technical insights into open source projects. So the intent of this is to amplify the feedback loop of the end user community back into projects, to assist the technical oversight committee in identifying adopters and conducting those interviews, so that we can also facilitate more concentrated and focused feedback to the projects about what that adopter experience is. And we've started making changes within the TOC itself, that there are many adopters of cloud native projects, even open source projects generally, that are concerned if they say they're using it, it's a security breach or it's a security risk associated with their organization. So the TOC now has an option for organizations that have that level of concern to do an anonymous interview. We'll still meet with you, we'll still talk with you, we'll ask those questions. We anonymize the responses, and we work with the partner organization to ensure that they approve the content before it becomes public. Because to us, we want to be able to minimally identify the industry vertical that you're in, because that provides a little bit more context about your concerns and where you're at in integrating the project. But ultimately, your experience as an adopter will help the projects. And we would like to be able to identify opportunities for those users and adopters based off of their experience to contribute back to that project. And that is a wonderful conversation to have with them. I see you're having this problem. Have you talked to the project about it?
Right. And have those interviews been happening, those anonymous conversations?
They do. As part of our moving levels process and evaluating project maturity and production quality readiness, we conduct those interviews for both incubation and graduated projects. So we've started down this new adopter interview process. We've streamlined a lot more of the TOC processes to be more consistent. So we're hopeful in the next year we'll start to see better improvement and feedback with cloud native projects as a result.
So there's also a separate but related thread here to these discussions about open sustainability, about open product companies and how they can be successful with free software. And some people in the industry have specifically said the CNCF should do more to connect users of open source projects with the vendors that support them. What do you think about that?
I think there is a wonderful balance that has yet to be defined between open core organizations or vendors that drive open source projects, either within CNCF or other software foundations. We need to identify those opportunities for, as I stated before, those maintainers that have excellent ideas. They want to go and build businesses off of those, but they also want to be able to build a community because they're narrowly focused on a particular technology. And when you start building and growing your community, you get diverse perspectives and experiences associated with what needs to happen to be able to make that project successful. We need to be able to strike that balance. Now, there are plenty of adopter organizations who see an open source project, they learn about it, they might use the open source component to kind of tinker with it and understand how it works, but ultimately they might find out that it's too much engineering effort to be able to integrate the open source project themselves as it exists today, or that it lacks maybe an integration that they're looking for and they don't have the time or capacity to be able to contribute that integration back to the project. So the CNCF does have vendor neutrality guidelines on what kinds of content can be posted to our open source projects, particularly when there are vendors that offer enterprise solutions built on top of open source. And that is one way that adopters and end users of cloud native projects can seek out and identify vendors or other organizations that can provide those services and meet their needs, because the needs of a journalist or news agency who is focused more on their product, delivering the news to individuals, may not have the engineering expertise to integrate and maintain a full cloud native architecture. And it's perfectly acceptable for them to go to a vendor or several vendors to build the architecture to meet their needs, but still contribute their lessons and learnings back to the open source projects, either through talking at KubeCon or submitting other CFPs to talk about their user experience around the open source project itself. And that is one way that they can start both contributing back, but also how we can connect more end users with vendors within the ecosystem. It's just a matter of knowing where to look and making sure that the projects and the vendors behind some of these companies are compliant with the vendor neutrality guidelines that the CNCF issues.
Right. There is that balance you have to strike between picking winners, as I've heard it phrased, and fostering that growth. Right.
The Technical Oversight Committee does not allow for kingmaking. That is one of our things. We strive to ensure that there is healthy competition between open source projects because that is what sparks and drives innovation. And we've seen a lot of success with that. Part of that is the explosion of growth in the CNCF projects themselves over the past several years, but also because having those opportunities for even competing organizations or competing individuals to come together around consensus of this needs to happen for both of us to be able to grow. We see this with the development of specifications, especially as that common agreement from which all others can build and innovate on top of. Kubernetes is an excellent example of where that vendor neutrality and those partnerships and collaboration come together for the greater good of everybody. And that's really where that balance can be struck.
I hear a lot from different corners here in this overall discussion about the role potentially to be played by public-private sector collaboration. And you've had an interesting perspective because you've worked in the public sector, the private sector, and in open source communities. Are there ways that those three constituencies could collaborate more effectively that you see, or could further this discussion in ways that maybe they're not yet?
Well, you have to kind of evaluate the perspectives of each one before we can start developing a collaboration plan. Public entities have a very particular need. They have a mission and an obligation to do that. And because traditionally they are either nonprofit organizations or they don't really have any money bottom line that they need to be worried about. It's more about actually completing their mission that's been assigned to them either by the government or by their nonprofit charter. We need to get alignment with them on what contributions to cloud native actually needs. What are their concerns that they have? Coming from the Department of Defense background, working at the National Security Agency, their concerns are naturally going to be more security oriented. How can I, with high assurance, understand what the open source project is, what are their security guarantees, what have they actually done from a secure development perspective. The nice thing about open source is we make that all transparent and available, so you can independently inspect that. In the private sector, the interests are aligned very differently. It's more about either increasing the bottom line or advancing the organization's mission or delivering better content to your customers, any of those things. But you need to be able to map what those desired outcomes are to the open source projects that you're actually using. If you can't define how your use of an open source project contributes to your desired outcomes and goals, you're going to struggle with any collaboration opportunities because you're not going to be able to find where the right group is to go and show up to be able to advance what it is that you actually need. And then from the open source community, who's overburdened, overwhelmed with the amount of work that needs to happen, and they don't have a lot of time to do it. In some cases, many of them volunteer on nights and weekends, and in other cases, you've got organizations that are funding them to commit some or all portions of their time to their projects. But the reality is it's something that's squeezed in between meetings and between other work that needs to happen. So those opportunities for collaboration are going to be harder to find. There's also the difference of the individuals that are interested in advancing some of those areas. Most maintainers that I have talked to just want to continue to work on code. Governance and process is seen as a burden or a toilsome activity, and we try to streamline that as much as possible. So you need to have an engineer that's kind of got more of the technical leadership perspective, who has the skills and the knowledge to see the more strategic elements of how their open source project contributes to the world globally globally or how it reaches into the financial services industry to assist them in what it is that they're trying to accomplish. Those individuals need to have an understanding of both public and private sector desires and outcomes. And if the public and private sector are not documenting and declaring what those outcomes are and making them available, we're not going to have opportunities for collaboration.
Right. There is a little bit of that sort of documentation happening with CISA and the Open Source Security Summit, as well as the OpenSSF. But to that point about potentially diverging interests, a couple years ago, the OpenSSF articulated a fundraising goal of $150 million. And as far as I've heard, they haven't reached that goal yet. Do you think it's those competing interests that make it hard to get that momentum behind an effort like that?
I think that's part of it, but there's also the allocation of funds associated with those activities. You as an individual or myself as an individual are more likely to donate money to causes that we actually care about. And it's no different with any organization.
Right.
So if you're not providing activities, efforts, initiatives that your potential partners and peers can contribute dollars to, they're not going to be doing that. In addition, when we have sort of this economic decline that we've seen, organizations are going to pivot and focus on what their core is.
True.
They're going to stop with the Horizon 2 and the Horizon 3 activities. They're going to start slowing that funding down, which will impact them moving forward, but they need to be able to redirect those funds to be able to keep the business running, to secure their engineers,
Right.
hopefully that they don't have to have any layoffs. And when you've got these massive funding activities that might define a series of efforts and initiatives that people can get behind, they're still not necessarily going to be putting their full dollar into that. They might be putting a portion of it, or they might have to withdraw and drop altogether.
So we have a number of factors at work here between the macroeconomic picture and the role of government versus private sector. But to your point, there is increased awareness about these things. There seems to be a realization happening about free as in puppy, not free as in beer. So how do you see these things unfolding going forward? Do you think something's got to give here? Do you think we'll see real change on this front?
There's a couple of different ways that this can go. I see probably more sprawl in the next couple of years as private sector starts to realize the volume of different activities that we have and the lack of concentrated focus in several areas. You see this kind of with AI.
Sure.
I hate to say it because everybody's talking about it, but there are so many different AI initiatives and activities that are happening. There isn't a single body that people can go to. So we end up with this fracturing across the ecosystem and across industry. And like, what are we doing? What are we agreeing on? Where should we be heading? And then you have the government who's issuing kind of some of these guidelines out there, but they're not showing up necessarily to some of the open source meetings to make sure that they're in tune with the individuals that are doing the development of these new and emerging both technologies as well as tooling and standards to go with them. We're going to be in this confusion area for a while, which typically happens.
Yeah.
I've seen before a huge innovation event occurs. And once that innovation event occurs, you're going to start to see a little bit more collapse and a little bit more streamline and focus with cross industry and within the ecosystem. So probably about 5 years before we really start to get to that innovation peak, unless something dramatic happens in the next 2 years.
Yeah, there is that sort of a separate discussion, but I have wondered, especially with security, what might break the logjam in a way.
Yeah, security is one of those more difficult areas because security has been around for so long, but it was a forced reaction by industry to the dawn of the internet when it was based on trust and that you're here to learn. It was largely driven out of education and discovery and a lot of those kind of ideals that we get out of the hacking community and some of the universities and research-oriented work. But then we started to see more of those attacks and security became a reactive function. And it's been a reactive function since. We're now at this interesting culmination of events between Log4Shell, SolarWinds, and all of these high-profile vulnerabilities and attacks that have been occurring that security professionals are starting to take a step back and be like, why are we doing it like this? There have been so many changes with technology over the past 50 years, and yet a lot of our vulnerability management practices haven't significantly changed. On top of that, you're starting to get security professionals asking questions associated associated with the controls because we have a more diverse pool of technology. Security has to cover that from when it was created, probably 20 plus years ago. You have to be able to apply security controls to that. And then you also have to be able to apply it to technologies like WebAssembly, for instance, or containers or serverless environments. And those are fundamentally different technologies. And yet our security controls are still written at a high level. So you've got a gap from engineers that are just working on the code to try to understand what it is that we mean over here on this kind of checklist. And we're not really thinking about the project or the tooling in the context of the environment for which it is being deployed. We've lost the ability to appropriately manage risk on an organization or environment by environment basis. And I think that is the next wave of innovation to happen within security industry, is reevaluating kind of what we've been doing. We have a crisis of conscience going on right now. We need to get it together and modernize security.
I think that's a good place to leave off for now, but I'm sure we'll talk again on that topic.
Yeah.
And it's great to be able to finally talk to you directly. And I appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Yes, Beth, this has been fabulous. I really appreciate you inviting me to come on and talk about these topics that I'm very passionate about. It's been wonderful.
This has been IT Ops Query Season 1, Tech Tragedy of the Commons. If you have any feedback on this episode or want to share questions or stories we should consider covering, please reach out to me at bpariseau, that's B as in boy, P as in Peter, A-R-I-S as in Samuel, E-A-U, at techtarget.com. Please also consider rating, reviewing, or subscribing to this podcast on your platform of choice. And tune in next week for our continued conversations with industry experts about open source principles and sustainability. Thank you for being with us so far.